My name is Hongwei Bao. I'm Associate Professor of Media Studies from University Nottingham. I'm also the author of the book Queer China, Lesbian and Gay Literature and Visual Culture Under Post-Socialism. So in this talk, I'm going to introduce the main content of the book. So the book was published in June this year, 2020. So it's a very recent book. And the book has paperback version, ebook, e-back version, and hardback version. And on the Routledge website, you can also request a reviewer's copy and a teacher's copy. For example, if you are a lecturer and would like to consider the book in your classroom teaching, you can request a teacher's copy or instructor's copy of the book. So the book is primarily a book about queer cultural production in contemporary China. When I say queer cultural production, I primarily refer to community forms of media and culture, including queer literature, film, and contemporary art, and some performance art as well. So these cultural activities or cultural texts were produced by gays and lesbians for members of the queer community. So in fact, it's a book on queer community media and culture in contemporary China. When I say contemporary China, I primarily refer to the period in the past 40 years, which is from the 1980s to present. Historically, this is usually called post-Mao period or post-socialist period in modern Chinese history. And as you may know that this period marked the end of China's Maoism and socialism, and the post-Mao reforms has incorporated neoliberalism in its governance, and this has a profound impact on identities, communities, and cultural production in contemporary China. So this book is really about what kind of identities have emerged in post-socialist China with regard to gender, sexuality, and desire, and how media and culture represents those identities and communities. This book argues for the importance of culture in identity formation, community building, and social activism. So a lot of people in political movements and social movement studies argue for the importance of social movements such as the kind of gay pride or Stonewall and so on and so forth. However, this book really argues that in the contemporary Chinese context, cultural production is an important means of cultural activism or social activism, and it is a kind of culturally sensitive and socially and contextually contingent form of activism. In fact, it is queer activism with so-called Chinese characteristics. So the book delineates some post-socialist features of queer cultural production in the PRC context. So the book really focuses on the mainland Chinese context. It's attentive to the social and cultural specificities of that context in the post-Mao era, where neoliberal governmentalities and state hegemony really shape queer desires and identities in important ways. But the book is not following queer gay identity politics or an identitarian way of thinking. The book champions a post-identitarian way of thinking by thinking about identities but also beyond identities. And it is the argument of the book that those cultural forms and cultural productions construct identities, but at the same time they also destabilize those fixed notions of identities and challenge our understanding of queer identities and politics. So really, this book suggests a kind of anti or post-identity way of thinking and seeing the kind of post-socialist context as both producing identities and as unproducing identities. The book is interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary in nature, as you can see that it engages with a multiplicity of disciplines, including literary studies and film studies, media studies, contemporary art, and political theory and social movement studies, and so on, cultural studies and gender studies. But it also brings together all the disciplinary approaches and interdisciplinary approaches. So therefore, you see textual analysis of queer cultural text, as well as the sociological analysis and anthropological research into queer cultural production in contemporary China. So really it highlights transnational perspectives and transdisciplinary approaches to media and culture. It is a cultural studies book, so even when it looks at cultural text, it always is attentive to the social and cultural context that shape those textual productions and consumption. So this gives you a brief idea what the book covers. So the book is divided into 4 parts. With an introduction at the beginning and a conclusion or epilogue at the end. And at the end of the book, there's also an appendix with all the important events in China's queer history. So in those 4 parts, you can see that they primarily follow a chronological order from 1980s to around 2020. So the last text that it examines, Shanghai is Burning, which is extravaganza with a 2018 film, and Xiadi's exhibition in 2020 is still going on in different parts of the world. So it's more recent. So in a way that I'm using a chronological approach to delineate the emergence of identities and transformation of that identities. So you have queer emergence in the first part, and then instances of becoming gay and becoming lesbian narratives in part 2, primarily in the 1980s and early 2000s. And then we have 2 forms of queer urban space engagements. So primarily in the 2000 and 2010s, and the last one, queer migration, is really in the 2010s to 20s. It's more recent. So this is to bring you from 1980s to present, from inside China to a transnational, international context. So, and as you can see that I pretty much mixes up all the genre. So I don't have a section on literature and another section on contemporary art. Rather, everything is arranged thematically rather than according to their different genre and different types of works. So that's a kind of organizational structure of the book. So introduction. So introduction is usually the most important part of the book because it introduces what a book is about. It also actually makes statements about some kind of theoretical and disciplinary intervention that the book makes. So the introduction of the book lays out a key theoretical term for the book, which is post-socialist metamorphosis. So by metamorphosis, I mean change. So it's really the kind of transformation of society and transformation of individuals in the post-Mao and post-socialist era. So other people see those 2 processes as separate. So on the one hand, we have transformation of individual identity and desires. On the other hand, we have social changes. But I see the interlinkedness of those 2 processes, and I argue that it's the social changes that trigger the individual changes or transformation of individual subjectivities. So really, this book looks at the kind of social conditioning of identities as well as the kind of subjective formation of the social, and how gays and lesbians themselves actually participate in social changes, and how the social changes constructs gender, sexuality and desires in different ways. And my intervention is with a cultural activism, cultural aspect of activism. So other people say that political situation and social movements shape activism. But my thesis is media and culture function as an important form of activism, and they shape and construct identity, community, and desires in significant ways. And what follows after the introduction are different case studies to demonstrate how identities, desires, and subjectivities were produced in different historical conjunctures, and what they look like and how they might be used to interrogate the post-socialist reality and neoliberalism as we are situated in now. So the first chapter is a kind of historical chapter. It gives a historical context of the emergence of gay identities and queer desires in contemporary China. So in particular, I look at the kind of discursive formations of gay identities in the 1990s. So with the medical research, journalistic reports, as well as legal reforms in post-Mao China, that gay identity were talked about in different ways. So if you're familiar with Michel Foucault's approach, you will recognize that this is a kind of discursive approach to identity. I look at how discourses, or what kind of discourses were constructed at the time and in what power relations, and I situate the discourse about homosexuality in the kind of post-socialist imagination of modernity. So, and I argue that this kind of reimagination of post-socialist modernity gave rise to gay identities and queer desires. However, it also marks the kind of erasure of the socialist past, as well as a kind of ideological struggles of socialism and post-socialism in the contemporary post-Mao era. And this is followed by a case study. This is followed by an analysis of a lesbian film called Women 15 Minutes. So Women 15 Minutes was a film made by lesbian filmmaker Shi Tou. And Shi Tou and her partner Ming Ming traveled all over China, in different parts of China, and documented women's lives in different parts of China, from cities to the countryside, from Han areas to ethnic minority areas, from bigger cities to small towns, and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about Shi Tou's film is that she was engaging with feminist debates at the time. So with the debates of state feminism and liberal feminism, as well as kind of transnational feminism, so kind of women's desires were brought into existence through those feminist engagements. So I'm really talking about the kind of lesbian desire as being constructed in kind of discursive formation in the transnational feminist debates represented in this film called Women 15 Minutes. It's a beautifully made film. So this takes us to part 2 of the book. So part 2 of the book, Queer Becomings, documents two becoming queer stories. When I say becoming, I mean those identities, gay and lesbian identities, are not inherent, biological, and so on. So they are social and historical processes, and they came into being under particular context and in contingent social circumstances. So Beijing Story is a good example. So a lot of you might have read the online fiction Beijing Story, which is one of the most famous gay story from mainland China. But it is also adapted into a film called Lan Yu by Hong Kong filmmaker Stanley Kwan. So it's one of the best known Sinophone queer films. A lot of research has focused on the kind of Sinophone transnational flow of the text Lan Yu. But my focus is really on the kind of post-socialist element, on how the film allegorizes queer desires in the post-socialist era. So neither Lan Yu nor Han Dong, the two protagonists, were born gay. They met each other and then they fell in love and became gay through certain historical circumstances. So, and this film and the story really demonstrates that being gay was an outcome of the post-socialist social transformations and was kind of symptomatic of China's entry into global capitalism and its erasure of the socialist past. So ideological struggles were manifested in the gay story. So that's the story of Beijing Story. And then this is followed by a fan fiction, by a kind of Supergirl fan fiction. Many of you might know the kind of reality TV show, singing contest, Supergirl. And of course, there is a fan community actually born out of the program. So a lot of fans would actually write fan stories, fan fiction based on the characters. Here we have characters Liu Liyang and Shang Wenjie. So of course, their gender and sexuality were pretty ambiguous in the reality TV show. However, in the story, some fans pair them as girlfriends and imagine them as lesbians. So of course, this imagination of lesbianism and queer desire is very much intertwined with the kind of transnational desire and middle-class dream in post-socialist China. So here I'm really looking at the cultural production and consumption, how production and consumption are symptomatic of the kind of post-socialist allegory of modernity and imagination of transnationalism and of middle-class way of life in post-socialist China. So that's Pink Affairs. This then brings us to the third part. The third part deals with two instances of urban space, engagement with urban space. So first we have Fan Pepe's documentary, New Beijing, New Marriage, so which is a parody of the Beijing Olympics slogan, New Beijing, New Olympics. But this is an interesting engagement because basically on the Valentine's Day, some gays and lesbians went to Tianmen, which is near Tiananmen, to take wedding photo shoots. So you will see some gay wedding photo shoots and lesbian wedding shoots, etc. And at the same time, the filmmakers and the crew actually interview the audiences about their response, and the audience gave interesting response. So here there is a kind of trailer which gives you an idea of the different responses that the audience have about the wedding photo shoot. So that's from New Beijing, New Marriage.
太过亲密。
Okay, so that's Fan Pepe and Zheng Kaigui, or David Zheng's film, New Beijing, New Marriage. So which is about a kind of gay wedding photo shoot in central Beijing. What's interesting about this is that this is a form of documentary, but it's a performative documentary, which means it engages with the social realities. The shooting of this film is at the same time the creation of a historical event, and it is an important form of activism in China's queer history. So that's the first thing. And it is also a form of performance art to engage with the social. What's interesting is that how Chinese queer activists were using kind of transnational imaginaries and borrow language from the same-sex marriage in the West and transnationally. Basically, in China, same-sex marriage were not recognized. However, it doesn't prevent the activists from using the form to promote queer rights. So basically, in this case, there is also a kind of localization element in that the organizers have taken specific consideration of the spatial context and social and cultural context to make it Chinese, to make it a kind of appropriate form of queer activism in contemporary China. So that's New Beijing and New Marriage, a performative documentary from 2009. And such form of documentary and queer activism wouldn't be possible now because of the deteriorating environment for queer activists, for any kind of social activism in China now. So if the gay wedding photo shoot is a kind of middle class desire for same-sex marriage, for recognition of gay rights, then there's another example, which is a working class poet called Mu Cao. So Mu Cao is a working class person who wrote a lot of poems, and a lot of his poems depict a kind of gay cruising scene or queer scene in kind of factories and so on and so forth. So Mu Cao's poem is interesting because although he also engages and depicts queer urban space, but that is a different type of queer urban space from the middle class urban queer spaces. We really need to look at kind of social stratification of queer desires, gay identities, and queer urban spaces. So it is forms a strong contrast with the version that is demonstrated or represented in New Beijing, New Marriage. So, by the way, so Mu Cao's novel, In the Face of Death, We Are Equal, has been translated into English and is available on Amazon. So you're welcome to read it, which is a very rare piece of queer working class representation. Okay, so this brings us to the final section, or final part of this book. So in the final part, we look at transnationalism, we look at migration, we look at mobility. So chapter 7 is about a queer documentary, but this documentary itself documents a drag performance in Shanghai. The documentary is made by a British queer filmmaker, Matthew Barron, living in Shanghai. So he's part of Shanghai's queer communities. He documents a kind of transnational drag community working in Shanghai, putting together this elaborate show of drag performance. So let's look at a trailer from Matthew Barron's film Extravaganza.
We have this like cross-dressing performance throughout our history.
Okay, so that's Extravaganza, 2018 documentary film about a drag show in Shanghai put up by a group of international expats working in Shanghai. So this film is interesting because it documents a kind of underground queer drag culture in Shanghai. But Shanghai is a cosmopolitan city. Shanghai is a global metropolis, and it is where capital assemble and people from all over the world gather. It represents the future of China. So if Shanghai represents the future of queer China with kind of Shanghai Gay Pride and Queer Film Festival and so on and so forth. So we really need to look at this transnational dimension as always already part of the urban cosmopolitan queer culture. However, such a queer culture looks up to the West, although it talks back against the West. However, there is a very strong sense of Western hegemony or kind of dominance of global queer culture, in this case represented by the RuPaul type of drag culture in Shanghai. And this type of queer culture may look cosmopolitan and international. However, we also have to reflect on what kind of queer and drag experiences are being marginalized in such representations. By the way, there are some trans documentaries made by Chinese filmmakers actually that portrays the local drag performances in China. For example, Fan Pepe's film Be a Woman, Wu Niang, is a good example, which forms a sharp contrast. But both Extravaganza and Be a Woman are all documentaries that document drag or trans life in China, that documents different aspects of queer China, and they all showcase the diversity of queer China. Okay, so the last chapter. The last chapter deals with a very interesting case study, which is a paper cutting artist. The name is Xia Die, or literally Siberia butterfly. So Siberia butterfly was a farmer from Shanxi province, so from rural China. He learned paper cutting as a technique as a child, and then he got married to a woman and led a hard life and went to the city to make a living. And in his spare time, he made paper cuttings. And the paper cutting artwork that he makes actually sometimes portray homoerotic desires, like the ones that we see on the picture. These are some of the artworks by Xia Die. And there is a documentary about Xia Die's paper cutting. So I'm going to show you the beginning of that documentary to give you a sense of what paper cutting art looks like, and what a queer paper cutting art looks like. So this is a documentary made by Sexy Beijing and Queer Comrades, which are two community webcasts.
每当我剪的时候，我就忘记了所有的一切。我把一些我得不到的东西，在我剪子里边，我都能给它剪出来，所以我都得到了。西伯利亚蝶，因为我在西北，说我们那里空气特别冷，但有时也传统保守。我好像那种冷空气，好像那世俗的环境，好像西伯利亚的空气，跟我的翅膀冻僵了，我没有办法飞起来，所以我就西伯利亚蝶。但现在飞到北京来了。
Okay, so that's Siberian butterfly. So the Siberian butterfly is currently having exhibitions in New York and Berlin and so on and so forth. So he has become an internationally known queer artist. From a kind of folk artist to queer artist, from a ordinary farmer from northwest China to a kind of international queer figure, celebrated queer artist. That is a big transformation. And Xia's transformation of identity and subjectivity actually coincide with China's social changes. It also demonstrates actually the role of, in his case, neoliberalism, international art market, and transnational LGBT movement in shaping a person's identities. So really, the kind of the Siberian butterfly identity is a kind of crafted and cut identity, and I use paper cutting as a metaphor for the formation of subjectivity. So that's the Xia story is also interesting because it forms a strong contrast with the kind of drag performers from Shanghai. So they are different types of queer subjectivities. However, it is all through migration, mobility, and transnationalism that they manifest and that they represent and construct their queerness. So which is also a part of queer China in its international dimension. Okay, so the book doesn't have an conclusion, but it has a short epilogue and an appendix. The appendix is important because it is a chronology of the important historical events in China's queer communities and queer history. And I hope that it will be useful for researchers and those who are interested in China's queer history. And the book is the result of 10 years of research. So some chapters were written during my PhD years, and other chapters were written when after I have got my current job and so on, and with my engagement with different disciplines, including contemporary art and film and so on. So it's pretty much the kind of intellectual journey of myself in the past 10 years. But the book is not without problems. I have a lot of regrets. For example, there are some texts that should have been included in this book. Cui Zi'en's films and novels are, well, of course, important, and they deserve more attention. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to include them in this book. And there are also trans stories and novels and films and more things. So I hope that future researchers can take up the challenge and to write about things that haven't covered. A book cannot be comprehensive. It cannot cover everything. This is not a history of queer cultural production. It's a kind of analysis of exemplary works from queer cultural text, and the selection is necessarily subjective, biased, and selective. So I hope that people can follow this book and produce more scholarship and delve into this rich heritage of queer cultural production in contemporary China. So at the end of today's talk, I want to point you to some resources. So the Routledge has a website or web page for the book. And on the web page, you can download the book's introductory chapter. So let's go to the book actually and look at some important information that might be relevant for researchers. So the book has a kind of author's page. On the author's page, I've put together some important information, including some photos, news, for example. So the talks that I gave or the book reviews that have been published are collected in here. As well, you can also see some photos, some videos, photos, and images relating to the book and relating to queer culture in China. And they are all free, so you're welcome to consult them for your own pleasure or in teaching and learning. So that's the book's author's webpage. And the book has a digital version as well as hard copies. So for digital version, if you go to the book's digital website, you can download the introductory chapter for free. So go to the book's website and then click on the book and there is a section called Preview PDF, which allows you to download a free chapter to read. And if you're interested in the book, you're more than welcome to get a copy of the book for yourself. So that's all for my introduction. If you have any more questions or suggestions or critiques for the book, please feel free to contact me by email. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy reading the book.